Our first program this morning will be led by Dan Firger, who is a member of the Environment Program at Bloomberg Philanthropies, where he helps manage the Foundation's clean energy, climate change, and sustainable finance programs. In 2017, Dan helped launch the America's Pledge project, through which U.S. businesses, cities, states, and universities signed the We Are Still In agreement to underscore their commitment to the Paris Agreement. Former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg and California Governor Jerry Brown released a report on U.S. non-federal climate action at the COP23 meeting in Bonn, Germany, and there'll be a follow-up to that this fall. Dan will lead a discussion on subnational collaboration on climate change, and I invite Dan up to the stage along with I'll let him invite up his panel. There's 4 Ds in this panel, if you haven't noticed already.
So, as Ann said, I'm Dan Firger from Bloomberg. I'm just, without further ado, going to invite everyone up, and then we'll start the conversation. I think we've got a really great panel to kick things off. First is Dirk. Well, we'll start this way. David Hayes from NYU, the State Impact Center, the State Energy and Environment Impact Center, I believe right here. Dave Kang, sorry, you're one over.
Okay, one over.
Not that it matters, but Dave Kang from CU Boulder. And Dirk Forrister from the International Emissions Trading Association. Thank you all. So I'll just say a few words to situate this conversation and to really build on what we heard yesterday and how Bob and Ann have sort of framed this, which is we've been toying with different ways of talking about it. Subnational action makes it sound like folks are sort of below the national level, right? Non-federal action, it's true we're not talking about the federal government right now, but again, it's sort of a negative frame. I think this is really about the real economy and what America's Pledge and the sort of organic response last summer to President Trump's announced intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. What it really was all about is communicating first and foremost to the rest of the world that we live in a cooperative federalist kind of system in the US where we have, of course, the US EPA and the federal government. The State Department is meant to communicate out to the rest of the world what is happening in the United States. But actually we have 50 states, we have hundreds, thousands of cities, we have businesses that operate all over the planet, headquartered here in the United States. And President Trump announcing the US is out of the Paris Agreement really doesn't speak on behalf of that aggregation of actors, that real economy action that's represented here at this conference. So the first thing we did is we really thought through how do we tell the story of what's really happening in the US economy to people not in Denver who kind of get what's going on here in Colorado or with Excel here in the power sector. We heard from David yesterday from Excel, but more like if you're in Dakar in Senegal or if you're in Denmark, not Denver, how do you think through what is happening in the United States? Where are we going? What does it mean that the president says we're out of the Paris Agreement? It actually does not mean we're not taking action on climate change. And so the first thing we did is we put together, as Ann mentioned, this We Are Still In declaration. Many folks, I think, in the room have signed on to it. Many more are aligned with what that statement was all about, which is we're not stopping, we're not slowing down. In fact, a lot of us are doubling down on clean energy, on decarbonizing our supply chains, on making investments in research and R&D, all sorts of other things which we'll hear more about. And really, in our experience at Bloomberg Philanthropies, we fund a lot of good work. We often fund work that's difficult and takes time and is slow moving and doesn't capture the headlines on the front pages of the world's newspapers. But this one, this We Are Still In statement, really did kind of go viral almost. And I think it was really because we tapped into a feeling and a moment, many of you in the room I think agree, that was ripe for the picking. And so US cities, US mayors within those cities, US companies, the CEOs in those companies, university presidents, governors of course, all of them were already doing a lot of this stuff, and I think what we provided here and what we're hoping to spend more time talking about on this panel and beyond is an organizing principle and a platform to really aggregate, quantify, and communicate what all of this non-federal or real economy or subnational climate action means for, first, the international audience that's not necessarily aware of all of those different heterogeneous actors in the US economy. And second, and probably more important, for all of us collectively here in the US to have a bit of a roadmap and a playbook for how to do more together. How to cooperate city to city, or city to state, or business to city, or business to state, and then how to have those actors in the real economy in the US communicate and collaborate with counterparts, whether at the national level or the subnational or private sector level in the rest of the world. So in France, in Canada, in China, in India, many, certainly US businesses, but even governors and mayors are finding willing counterparts and collaborators internationally. And so we're really, I think privileged to have the panel here on stage with us to be able to drill down a bit into, first, Dirk, what is going on with the Paris Agreement, where we are and where we're going in terms of this international kind of response to where the US right now is at the federal and non-federal level. And then we'll get into a bit more detail with David and Dave about state attorneys general and the important role that they play, as well as universities and the important role that higher education institutions are playing in all of this work. So without further ado, Dirk.
Sure. Thanks, Dan, and thanks for a very nice framing of this conversation. I guess from the perspective I have, my organization, IETA, was really established to work on UN policy level things and to help with implementation through sharing of business experiences on how emissions markets can work to help the planet. And I think the big difference of the Paris Agreement over the prior agreements is the bottom-up nature of the action embedded in it. And it really is an agreement that's about trying to stimulate actors like those you're describing to step forward. It has space in it for both what they would call non-state actors, and that, by the way, non-state actors includes states, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's non-states in the UN context, so non-countries. But to try to capture all of that and mobilize it toward this really set of fairly high ambitions of keeping warming to no more than 2 degrees, or perhaps as low as 1.5 degrees. So it's a massive undertaking. I think I don't want to sugarcoat it, that the loss of US leadership does matter. But I do think that people are aware of the divisions going on in the United States, and they see California doubling down on its program. They see Reggie's taking steps to implement its program through the 2020s and strengthen it. And they see other states looking at those programs and whether they could step up and collaborate in that fashion. And I think that's all super healthy, that we have that example of leadership. But I think that that's made possible because of the real economy stuff that you talked about, and how it's a lot easier for people in government roles, like the three of us have all had government roles on this, and it's a lot easier to put policies together when you have a willing business partner in it. And I think part of that is enabled because of the huge changes in the cost structure of energy supply options in this country. So it's making it possible for our power sector to transform itself. I'm taken every time I read one of the energy trade rags with the various power companies that are setting their 2030 and 2050 goals that are pretty much in line with what we were trying to legislate in the Waxman-Markey years. And yet with natural forces and state-level encouragement, many of them are stepping forward. And I think it's a marvelous thing, so that once the feds come back to this topic, they're going to have a power sector that is already on a very helpful path, at least in most states. I think that's true. And I do want to say one other thing about the Paris Agreement, that I think the real ability for it to deliver in the long term has to do with sort of these elements of trust that are established in it about whether countries follow through on what they say they're going to do. That's one place where the U.S. moves are very unhelpful right now and where the state action is super important. But the other part is about how they cooperate together. And a lot of that is around harmonizing programs, of learning from each other, and then ultimately connectivity between the programs. So for my organization, one of the most exciting developments last year wasn't at the COP in Bonn, which was kind of the typical drudgery of going through implementation rules and countries back to negotiating positions where you're really trying to understand where they want to end up in a couple of years' time. But where the real encouraging part came was in the summit in Paris on the 12th of December, and the president of Mexico came forward, maybe a little unexpectedly to a lot of that crowd, but with a declaration of carbon pricing in the Americas, and had all the jurisdictions that are interested in building cooperative approaches and hopefully a common carbon market together in an initiative to try to work on harmonization of their programs and building blocks that can enable them to connect. And I know where this came from. It came out of World Bank's Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition efforts and conversations around the edges of conferences like this, where frankly, it was not inspired by New York or California. It was inspired by Chile and Mexico getting together and saying, we ought to be doing this together. We can get farther together if we do cooperate. And maybe we can talk Canada and the Canadian provinces and the state of California into sharing their experiences and helping us do this. So this grouping has established. It had its first meeting in Santiago, Chile last month. And it's one to watch, I think, on how they work on these building blocks of change. All that's inspired by the Paris Agreement and this Article 6 contained within it that encourages voluntary cooperation through market approaches or non-market approaches if you want. There's so something for everyone there, but we're certainly seeing that it's had that effect of stimulating this creative approach by countries. And now I'm aware that in Asia, where I was last week, there are countries there talking about, well, if they're doing it, should we be doing it? And the same thing is happening in Africa, in various regions within Africa. So I think this spirit of cooperation, you all know the economics, it helps bring the costs down, it helps more ambition become possible, it reduces competitiveness distortions. So it's really got a lot to it, but I think we're really at the, I'd say sort of the foundation through the Paris Agreement of something really important there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, that's great. David, turning from sort of the international diplomatic level to a much more sort of legal and regulatory and sort of, tactical almost response to what the administration is doing on the Clean Air Act and other sort of bedrock environmental regulatory programs that really formed the building blocks of what Obama was able to bring to the Paris Agreement. Maybe could you talk a bit about what's going on with state AGs and what your center is up to?
Sure. First, thank you, Dan. Dan is my funder, so I really appreciate the chance to be with him again. And Dan just got off a plane from Australia like 24 hours ago, so if the head comes down on the lap, we'll know why. I want to do a shout out to Bob Perciasepi too, my former partner in crime in the Obama administration. The deputies of the major agencies did a lot of conspiring together. And all of you associated with the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions are very lucky to have Bob as your leader. So let me talk a little bit about state AGs. When I first talked to Bob about this, recognizing that this is a business-oriented effort here, the private sector working with government, there is a tendency to think of state attorneys general as maybe, whoa, I don't know if we're ready to talk to them. Those guys are the law enforcement folks. Yes, they are, but when it comes to climate change and clean energy, They are enforcing the law in the way that I think all of us in this room want them to, at least the progressive AGs. And what Dan and Bloomberg have formed, which I have the privilege of leading, is something called the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center. We are nonpartisan. We are associated with NYU Law School. We work with AGs who, from both parties who are working on progressive clean energy, climate, and environmental positions. And the AGs have been busy. Consistent with the theme of this conference, there's a lot of activity at the state level, both within the state and also state versus Fed in this difficult time when the federal government is not supportive of clean energy and the environment. We just did a report that came out yesterday, State Attorneys General, 13 months of critical actions. Thank you, Intel, for your wireless services. I dropped this in on that wireless link that all of you have to today's program, so you should be able to access our report. It's remarkable. And there are two big buckets here I want to talk about briefly of the activity of state AGs. One is defense, and that's been a big part of the last 13 months, because as we all know, President Trump has looked to dismantle climate-related initiatives on a number of levels. Also, the administration has shown a obvious and concerning bias toward fossil fuels, which also has implications, obviously, for our change in economy toward a clean energy economy. And he's looked to stop energy efficiency programs through Secretary Perry's initiative, looked to do some special benefits for coal, for example. AGs have been a very strong line of defense on all of these matters, as chronicled in this report. On the climate initiatives, they have been strong with the Clean Power Plan. The latest brief was filed last Friday on the advance notice of proposed rulemaking for potential replacement rule. Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, in particular, has led a group of about 16 AGs that have been all over that. On the methane issues, both for the oil and gas industry, both on the EPA side and the BLM side, the AGs have been deeply involved. They've also dealt with this fossil fuel bias. They've come out strong against the opening up of the essentially the entire Outer Continental Shelf for oil and gas drilling. They've sued on the relaxation of fracking requirements for public lands, the fiscal giveaways that we're seeing as the evaluation rule was overturned by the government. And the AGs have had some important wins. All of you watching energy efficiency issues noticed that the Northern District of California, within the last couple of weeks, required DOE to get out those 5 energy efficiency rules that had been swept under the rug by the administration. Earlier, there had been the ceiling fan rule that came out. On methane, the AGs have forced the administration to not take the shortcuts, to not just have these extended periods, but to go through rulemakings that will in turn be challenged. But on the affirmative agenda, there's so much to talk about too, and I just want to highlight a couple of important areas there. First of all, you may not know this, but 19 state attorneys general signed the We're Still In pledge. Just evidencing the strong views that these law enforcement officers have toward the importance of pushing toward a clean energy economy. Perhaps one of the most significant aspects of this particular report that I mentioned is their emphasis on clean energy. I'll tell you that, and AGs have a terrific platform on clean energy. They are state-elected officials that represent the consumers in their state. Many of the state AG offices, also within their office, handle the energy issues. They represent electricity customers. They address the electricity future. They are implementing in those progressive states that have those aggressive renewable energy standards, they're implementing those standards and making sure that there aren't barriers to competition that stand in the way of more customer choice in energy, more clean energy, more innovation, and dropping those barriers that are keeping out progressive companies and et cetera. And the final thing I want to talk about here before we get into, before Dave talks and we get into questions, is there's an interesting initiative that the center has working with state AGs to focus on the affirmative agenda that will promote the clean energy economy. And we have identified 5 principles that will guide the collection of stories and actions in progressive states that are happening that demonstrate the move toward a clean energy economy. Number 1, the AGs will be protecting and promoting state and federal clean energy policies. That's very important. So you have New York and Illinois, for example, working to promote clean energy with their own policies. You've got the possibilities of taxes in the Northwest. There will be challenges against those. The AGs are going to stand up for the state prerogatives to manage their electricity systems. Second, the AGs are focusing on expanding residential and business customer opportunities to procure, save, store, and generate clean energy. I don't have to tell you, the business community is looking, the business community and the consumer community want to have more of a say in the energy options that they have. Attorney generals want to provide that voice to customers against sometimes the incumbent folks who aren't excited to hear those voices. Third, the AGs are looking to deploy smart grid tools and new rate structures that will provide the backbone for a cleaner energy economy, more resilient, more customer-driven power system. We all know that some incumbent utilities may talk about grid modernization in a way that actually may create some barriers and not open things up. Fourth, the AGs are going to be looking to ensure that their investments in capital and operating infrastructure that are made in their states are really needed, are competitively sourced, and won't crowd out clean energy options. Big issue today in a lot of states. Pipelines coming in, a lot of big infrastructure investments that may, in fact, help incumbents and hurt the opportunities for more clean energy growth. And finally, fifth, AGs want to make sure that customers are not overpaying for electricity services. They've taken a lead, for example, after the tax cut to ensure that the utilities refund that money that they will no longer have for their taxes back to consumers. To the extent that those funds are used for other purposes, they're going to be a cop on the beat to make sure the infrastructure investments used with that windfall redound to the benefits of their constituencies. So I'm excited about the forward lean of many state attorneys general on clean energy. I see a wonderful opportunity for in many states for the AGs to work with the business community to open up the electricity sector, particularly with the exciting advent of electrifying the transportation sector and all of the related issues around that. They're legal, they're policy, and they come from the governor's office, but the implementation has to come, I think, from combining the business sector and those progressive AGs. We can do tremendous stuff together. So, thank you.
Thanks, David. That was a great overview of a very complicated set of issues and set of political actors. Turning from a somewhat political, and obviously when you're talking about a law enforcement action at the state level or at the federal level, you're talking about a somewhat adversarial legal process. We're turning now from that to a much more, I think, collaborative and universities being, often the most important impartial entity in a state or in a region. Dave, it would be great to hear a bit about CU Boulder, the work you're doing at CU, and the broader landscape of how universities are showing up in this sort of climate moment that we're in.
I have a little bit of history in DC as well. I was there 6 years before I came to Boulder. So I wanted to touch on what I'm doing now in the role of higher education, and then a little bit maybe on national security in my previous role when I was with the Navy and some resilience work I did when I was at the White House. So specifically on higher education, throughout history, the university has always been a respected pillar of our communities across the globe. Our institutions are driven by two fundamental activities, education and research. We strive to shape and educate the next generation of citizens and leaders. We're also about discovery, finding the truth, sharing knowledge, and solving problems. It's in our DNA. This is what we do day in and day out. About a month ago, CU Boulder, along with 12 other partner universities from the US, Canada, and Mexico, announced the formation of the University Climate Change Coalition, but otherwise known as UC3. And this idea was rooted in the idea that research universities should take on an expanded role in creating a better understanding of climate change through research, data collection, modeling, and how that can inform action, particularly at the local and regional level, in a non-political way. Finding the truth and figuring out how we can work together to solve these problems. So what does a university bring to the table? We bring expertise in areas of climate modeling, energy storage, next generation renewable technologies, smart energy and efficient technologies, sustainable transportation solutions, and innovations, as well as a deep understanding of the social sciences, economics, policy, and regulation. It really is a one-stop shop for thought leaders to figure out how we can work together to solve these issues. A real example of what we're doing at CU Boulder is the creation of a living sustainability laboratory on our campus where we plan on integrating research with our daily operations as well as education. How do we create a fertile ground where we actually promote innovation and entrepreneurship, where we can bring together our researchers, industry partners, venture capital, with the goal of actually taking applied research quickly into commercialization so that we can actually solve these issues quickly. I'm really excited about the opportunity to enhance our operations as well, because I'm responsible for the facilities and the operation of the campus, taking some of that research, the data analytics, the Internet of Things, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and see how that can actually make an impact on our efficiency, sustainability, and resiliency as well. David, you mentioned regional transportation. I mean, that's a huge issue, and I think a huge opportunity where we can partner with the community, regional transportation such as RTD in Boulder, maybe the school district, not just higher education, but K through 12 as well, because we share similar challenges with the community. How can we work together to actually solve some of these issues? I think we all clearly recognize that we can't do this alone. I call it our individual cylinders of excellence, my polite way of saying silos. It really is a partnership. We have to work with everyone that's here and everyone that's not here, probably especially everyone that's not here. Climate change, energy, and resiliency is also a national security imperative. I know because I was there. Every day, the Navy and the Marine Corps is out there protecting the global commons, and maybe more of it, especially with the sea lanes opening up in the Arctic. How do we handle that? We keep this world safe from acts of piracy, and we provide humanitarian assistance here in the US as well as around the world. But to do this, we need energy, and lots of it. Our reliance on fossil fuels, especially foreign sources of fossil fuels, makes us and made us more vulnerable to price shocks, supply shocks, natural man-made disasters, and political unrest in oil-producing countries. And some of these countries are not our friends or allies. A specific example, in FY12, because of price spikes, we had to deal with a $500 million unplanned bill during the year of execution. That has huge implications on national security because we can't train, we can't operate. And how does that make us ready to do what we need to do? For our troops deployed in Afghanistan, the price was more sobering. For every 50 fuel convoys we brought into theater, we had 1 Marine killed or wounded. And that was too heavy a price to pay. Increasing energy efficiency on the battlefield and reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, both for the shore and the fleet, became a priority for our Secretary of the Navy, as well as our Commander-in-Chief. And I'm proud to say that I think it's still there. It's inculcated into the culture of the Department of Defense, and I don't think it's going to change. For us, energy efficiency really equated to enhanced combat capability, energy security, and an equally important, lives saved, so that people can actually come home to their families after getting the mission done. And I think in the last decade, we really accomplished a lot. Solar blankets for our Marines, hybrid electric drives for our ships, alternative fuel vehicles on our bases. Very proud to report we actually surpassed our 1 gigawatt goal and actually was able to do 1.3 gigawatts of renewable energy for the Department of the Navy for our shore facilities 4 years ahead of schedule. And that's with the leadership of Secretary Mavis and some of the great folks that we had in the Department of the Navy. We also partnered with the Department of Energy and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Industry under an authority known as the Defense Production Act to really accelerate the commercialization of advanced drop-in biofuels for the military and private sectors. And it wasn't just in the US. We were working with our allies in Australia, in Japan, in Italy, in Spain, across the world to see how we can actually make this a worldwide effort to get renewable biofuels into the marketplace. Shifting the focus a little bit to climate impacts, because this is what we have to live with every day. Climate resiliency, that's what keeps me up at night. How do I keep the campus functioning despite, say, the flood that we had in 2013 or wildfires or droughts? And this is also something that kept me up when I was at the White House, because that was my job, is to make sure that everything was functioning. We live in a dynamic and sometimes unforgiving environment. If the impacts from Hurricane Katrina, Sandy, and more recently Harvey, Irma, and Maria don't wake us up, what will? We need to be prepared for disruptions. We need to invest in capabilities that help us weather these storms. We need to work together as a community to identify and mitigate the vulnerabilities. And I'm really excited to say that we are doing that as a campus at CU Boulder. We're working very closely with the city of Boulder to figure out how we can actually work together to mitigate some of these issues. We need to be able to keep our folks safe. We need to be able to quickly recover and resume normal operations and do it safely. Sustainability also means that all of these solutions have to be cost effective, right? It can't be at a premium. This has been a focus for our team at CU. We're focused on becoming smarter and more efficient and more sustainable so that we can become more resilient. And I think we can actually showcase how we can do that, and maybe others can emulate that as well. And we're not the only ones that are doing that. But we can't do it in a vacuum. And so I think the value that we bring is that we have research, we have innovation, we have thought leaders who can think across the spectrum, and we really have a community that really wants to work together to solve some of these issues. So that's why I'm here. I'm here to change the world, and I'm here to ask all of you to help join me in doing that as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, that was great. We've got a wide range of experience here on the dais, as well as a set of networks that you all represent. I'm aware of the fact that most of the rest of the panels today will involve many more corporate speakers than we have here on this particular panel. So one thing I wanted to do is, maybe Dirk, starting with you, just bring in a bit more of the sort of collaboration that you were talking about, the trust and collaboration on the Paris Agreement, in particular in light of how businesses either are, or maybe more in the future can do more collaboration with some of these non-federal or subnational, whether it's AGs or universities or governors or mayors. Where do you see some of these opportunities in the real world in your work at IETA?
So I think a couple of different places. One is that business does have solutions to deploy. We need legal frameworks in which to do that. Paris gives you kind of like this big overarching structure to work within. but working at more at the state, local, national level where policy tends to take hold, I think is really where most of the emission reductions can be unleashed. And I think as I worked on this issue, since before the Clinton administration, when I was a congressional staffer, the business opposition back then was so much more dramatic. There was no solution in sight. All you could see was this huge cost curve ahead of you, and it was scary, and you knew that it was going to really upset the apple cart in terms of the way we made and used energy at that point in time. But here, 20 years later, we're in a much different posture. We're in a posture where, at least from my perspective, a lot of the companies that are needed to deliver those solutions have learned in their own operations, maybe through some of their university partnerships and experiences, that yes, action is possible. There's a lot more that can be done. But the cooperation piece really lends itself to how you go out across state borders or across national borders to get at the lower cost abatement opportunities. Boy, that sounded wonky, didn't it? Abatement opportunity. You try to seize the goal of emission reductions, and being able to cooperate across borders is super important. Companies don't operate, just within one place anymore. There's, we're spread around so much that I think a lot of it is about how companies optimize within their own operations, and also how they assure that, you can see this in China. So China's setting up a national emissions trading program, and they're learning through pilot examples of it. In their pilots, they've had the struggles of, okay, we're in a pilot in this province, but our facilities outside the province are not included, so should we just, there's an incentive to shift production. And companies are aware that you really need broad legal structures that tie it all together. And I think the prize in it, for me anyway, is about how you make the whole enterprise cost-effective enough so that you're inspired to go further. World Bank estimates are that if we have approaches that extend beyond borders, the Paris goals for 2030 are about a third cheaper, and for 2050 are about 50% cheaper. That means that it's much more feasible. It's much more likely, to your point about sustainability, and that sustainability means that it's cost effective. It enables business to be a partner in that because it can extend out to wherever the opportunities are. So these cooperative structures I'm talking about, market linkages, enable that to happen. And we have that a little bit in the United States, but frankly, you have to look outside the U.S. right now to really see it flowering, to see how China's looking at that across all of its provinces, how Canada to the north is looking at it across its provinces, developing pricing systems that can work one way in BC and can work a different way in Ontario and Quebec. Ontario and Quebec are linked to California. California might link to Washington and Oregon. Mexico would like to tie into all of that. This is all about this cooperative approach that helps bring down the costs and helps make greater ambitions more politically feasible because they're cost effective and business comes on side. So that's what I see happening out there. And the last thing I guess I just wanted to touch on is one of the big changes, at least as I have conversations with my U.S. members, and understand IETA is about 135 companies, it's global, so about a third of our members are here in the United States. And as I sit with members here and talk about what's happening in Washington and what's happening with state level action through AGs, the big shift that I've seen is they're very aware of their customer interests and very aware of their investor interests. And their investors want to know what their plan is for remaining resilient, for remaining sustainable as a company, to grow their profits. And they need to know that the climate issue is being well managed. And that has to be done even with chaos in Washington and climate programs, right? Because CEOs can see through one administration to the other, and the investors are demanding it of them. So I think that's been probably the most phenomenal shift, is to see people say, well, you know, maybe our federal affairs office is giving me really sad information about federal leadership on this, but my customers and my investors expect more of me than that. And I think you'll hear that throughout the day from corporate officials here. The investors are requiring it, the customers want it. There's not an electoral college that governs all of that. There aren't Senate seats that are, you know, from sparse areas that make, you know, for a company that make that more important, right? It's a different calculus. It's about selling your product to a public that has high standards, and to an investor, and maintaining your investor base that has high expectations. So I think it's really a phenomenal change that's taken place in this company, but it also means the pressure is on all of us to help unleash action through all of that.
Quick plug. I work at Bloomberg Philanthropies, unrelated but very within the same sort of organizational family. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which is part of Bloomberg the company, does a bunch of work on sort of market trends and the prices for renewables, et cetera. One of the things that we often observe is, notwithstanding the fact that solar is outcompeting coal in many parts of the world, wind is coming in cheaper even sometimes than gas in many parts of you know, red state America, where the political leadership might not necessarily represent that sort of market truth. David, back to something you brought up, the rules of the road, the market, the sort of regulatory framework that's been set up over, you know, maybe the past 100 years in some cases with state public utility commissions, et cetera, that's all been designed to optimize a different set of energy choices. And so maybe just for the sort of business audience in the room, if you could talk a bit more quickly, because I want to leave some time for questions, about some of the issues that AGs are grappling with around kind of rewriting the rules of the road for clean energy. It is obviously an incumbent's game when it comes to access to utility commissions, access to the very arcane world of energy regulatory policy, especially at the state level.
Yeah, so the assumption, I think, is that there needs to be hand-to-hand combat in every state to open up the grid, because the grid is typically regulated by state-sponsored utilities, and the nature of that relationship is sui generis, arguably from state to state. But what's happened, there is a fundamental thing happening in the U.S., and it's what Dirk is talking about, which is that many businesses in this room are demanding a seat at the table. And when a Google or a Walmart or a GM say, I want 100% renewable energy, why can't I get it in Alabama or South Carolina? That's not right. That is changing the rules. But as long as as there's a sense that this has to be played out in hand-to-hand combat from state to state, it's going to take too long to open up these markets, in my view. There certainly has to be state-based initiatives, but I think there's an opportunity to have more of a national conversation about the fact that our electricity legal structures were set up over 100 years ago at a different time for a different purpose, when there wasn't enough capital and you couldn't have competition. Michael Picker, CPUC chair, has been very candid about this. We're designed to be non-competitive. And yet you're seeing now the benefits of competition because of some leadership in the 90s and 2000s at the federal level with FERC, with interstate markets. We need to get the word out that actually markets and competition and innovation, because of the leadership of many people in this room, presents an opportunity for us as a nation to move forward. We're going to have to deal with it largely on a state level, but we need to have that national conversation, which is why I'm hoping that the state AGs, among many others, can bring together in one place the stories that show the benefits of competition, of innovation, of customer choice, of non-vertically integrated utilities. And the PG&Es of the world, Kit Batten, by the way, was my science advisor, now happily ensconced at PG&E, and the XLs of the world, and the many other businesses, both utilities and also customers that are helping to change the legal structure. They have allies in state AGs, and we want to bring those stories together. I think this conference is extraordinarily well timed for that purpose, because we can get concerned about what's happening at the federal level. The action is at the state level right now, and let's take advantage of that and tell the stories that need to be told.
Speaking of telling stories, we have a room full of great experts out here. We have about 10 minutes left for questions. So I think we have folks with microphones who will be circulating. If you want to ask a question of anyone on the panel, please feel free to raise your hand. We'll try to see you in the back of the room as well. Anyone? Don't be shy. Yes, Anne, you can go first.
Thank you. Anne McCabe, the Climate Registry. Dirk, I wondered if you'd talk a little bit more about the opportunities and challenges when it comes to linking regional and other trading programs, especially between countries.
So I was just in Tokyo last week for a meeting with a bunch of climate negotiators, and we actually dissected how a couple of these linkages work. It goes back to legal agreements, right? And it's essentially, I think the two models that we have are the California-Quebec one, where there's an MOU that grew out of years of collaboration that has these core elements. They learned from Reggie on a similar set of core elements. It kind of comes down to the categories of how good how broad the coverage is, and is it covering some similar sectors? Does it have good emissions data underlying it? Does it have targets set that are of similar stringency? That's probably the toughest part. And then there's a lot on how measurement and verification work. And at the end of the day, it all, in the California example with Quebec, it all comes together in a common registry, right? Where they operate a registry where they recognize each other's units. And I guess most in this audience would know Ontario joined that system in January, so that now it's gotten a good bit more heft to it. It's the largest carbon market in North America now. That's the way that one works, is you kind of join, you sign on to the MOU, you sign on to a rule set on those kind of common elements, but you have to be accepted by the other members of the club. And in the state of California, that boils down to a certain set of findings that the governor has to sign off on. The international version of that might be a little different. That might be more through a linking agreement. And the recent arrangement that we've seen on that, it's a tiny one in a way, but it's this enormous European Union that recently signed a linking agreement with Switzerland, because Switzerland's, operates on its own, but it conforms to a lot of EU laws. So in that one, there's a treaty in place because it's nation to nation, and it involves all of those same things. And if you go and look at this actual, your law students would love to do this, go and dig into what's actually there. What's actually there is a whole lot about the registry and registry security and how, because they know the targets and the coverage and the monitoring, reporting, verification systems are common. And so I think that's what others are looking at are these things where you kind of join via opting into this sort of a structure like California and Quebec have through the WCI Incorporated, so you opt in, or in the case of nation states, do they more sign treaty arrangements? And my suspicion is that's the two models that will continue. For subnationals, it's this MOU approach because it's got a little, they don't have treaty-making power, so it's a way to get around that. Well, now, that was a geeky question, and I gave a geeky response. But
it's a geeky panel.
Asked and answered. But I do think under the Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement doesn't do the connections. It provides accounting standards. the agreements will then be with other members of clubs that form.
It's an important point. I'll look in the audience. If you do have a question, raise your hand. But just on that point, one of the things that we found just in the work we do across cities and states and businesses and all the sort of heterogeneous actors we've been describing, I mentioned this in my opening remarks, you know, the Secretary of State for the US government is meant to be the chief diplomat for our country and to go out around the world and speak on behalf of the whole. Right now on this climate issue, we don't particularly have someone who wants to do that job in good faith on climate. And so what we've got is a heterogeneous set of disparate voices, many of whom are doing things in their own state or in their own locality or in their own business, sort of inward facing or within their market segment or their sort of peer group in terms of companies. Again, back to you, Dave. How do universities play in that kind of role of convening, right? Bringing together, you know, the Colorado businesses, the mayor's groups, the governor, the academics, the science community, in creating, I think you mentioned, a sort of common narrative, a shared understanding of how we're going to kind of move forward in this much more, I guess I would call it disaggregated kind of space we're in right now on climate policy, not just globally because of the Paris Agreement, the way it's built, Dirk, but also because of this sort of lack of leadership at the top right now from the federal government down.
You know, I think the advantage that we have as a university is that because we are seen as a neutral party, that because we are not political, because we are doing things based on fact and data, that we are respected and people actually will come to the table when we ask them to. And so when we work with the city of Boulder, when we work with you know, industry via, for instance, an RTD, CDOT, the different players, Google, IBM, I mean, we just happen to be located in a really unique spot in Boulder where we're surrounded by national labs and really progressive thought leaders. They will come to the table, the venture capitalists, to see how we can work together to come up with solutions. And as I said, that's what we've been doing for hundreds and thousands of years as universities, right? We look for problems that need to be solved. We have students and faculty that do research into these areas. And then if we can tie that with the power of industry and see how we can actually multiply some of these solutions and take it out, it's extremely powerful. And then the coalition that we created where we can work with our partner universities, specifically in this case across North America, and share some of those lessons learned and share some of those success stories. And actually showcase how we did it and how we actually made a difference. And one of the unique capabilities that we have within CU Boulder is all the climate research that we're doing. So not only are we solving some of the technological problems or maybe coming up with policy solutions, we can actually model what that means. So if, for instance, IBM or Google or Amazon work together and we can figure out how we can do artificial intelligence to control our building systems, and that equates to a 30% reduction in energy consumption, our institutes can model what that means to the world if this can be deployed at scale. And so that could actually, create new industries and new thoughts and new policies on how we can actually accelerate some of the things that are important to everybody. So it may be profit, it may be emissions reduction, it may be, a reduction in global temperature, it may be anything. What I think we can do as a university, as a neutral party, is actually reach out to all these different stakeholders that have different priorities and bring them together to see how they can work together toward a common goal.
We've got our work cut out for us. Any last questions in the audience before we wrap? Yeah, right here in the middle. Just wait, we'll have a mic brought over to you.
Hi, I'm Jeff Thompson. I'm a pediatrician and former CEO of the Gunderson Health System and the current board chair of Healthcare Without Harm, which is a group of organizations across 50 countries. But in the United States and North America, we have, like you, David, we have a group of 10 or 2 dozen or 3 dozen who really lean into this. And then there's the thousands more. I mean, there's thousands more universities across North America and the rest of the world and health systems, you know, we're 20% of the economy just about. How would you suggest we take these very innovative things that are coming out of universities and take it from our core group of first adopters and really spread, to your point, to the broad group and really get a multiple on those innovations and those changes? Because it's one of the things, we have people that say, yeah, we're in, they're not really in. I mean, they're not really in. How do you get them really in?
You know, I think it's actually bringing in different stakeholders, right? So at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, at the international level. And so a solution maybe that we can put in place in Boulder, I can actually work with, say, 100 resilient cities, or with Bloomberg, or with other agencies that's what they do, right? The UN. There are other folks that actually want to learn from us and see what we're doing and how we're being successful. And then we engage at the state level to see what are those regulatory barriers that are maybe preventing us from becoming or integrating more renewables. And then we showcase, right? Hey, how do we work with Xcel Energy? How do we change the regulatory structure within, say, the state of Colorado? And it may not be the exact solution that fits in a different state, but what it shows is that we can work together to make changes. And then at the national level, you know, what are those policy barriers, whether it's at FERC or whether it's at DOE or DOD, and who are those folks that we need to engage with that we can actually build as allies that can help work with us, right? So in the case of Department of Defense, it's a huge, huge machine. And so if you can change the way the department thinks, and as I said, I think that culture of innovation, efficiency, it's already there and it's not going to go away. But how can we do that across multiple, say, federal agencies, state agencies, and even industry, right? So if the motivation is profit, and you can show them by becoming more efficient, you're going to actually save on your utility bill. And not only that, you're not going to lose production, because by having that solar array and that energy storage or that fuel cell, your production plant will never go down. Well, that's something that they can actually relate to. And it also can have a direct impact on emissions reductions as well as the bottom line. And so, you know, how do we actually showcase these success stories? And I think the universities are really primed to be able to lead that discussion. Because again, we are not doing it for political reasons. We're doing it because we have research, we have technology development, and in a non-political way, we can actually share the facts and actually show how it can actually make a difference.
Thanks, that's great. We're out of time. I'd love you to join me in thanking these panelists for a really illuminating conversation.